The gunshots echoed through the dense forest, causing birds to scatter in panic as Felicity Reed sprinted between the towering pines, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped animal. Her once pristine blue dress was now torn and mudded, her boots caked with dirt as she fled deeper into the wilderness outside of Walla Walla, Washington in the autumn of 1878. Behind her, the shouts of men grew more distant, but she dared not slow her pace. "Find that thieving woman," a gravelly voice commanded, followed by the sound of horses crashing through the underbrush. "She can't have gotten far." Felicity's lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, her honey-blonde hair falling loose from its pins. The satchel containing her few possessions bounced painfully against her side with each desperate stride. She hadn't stolen anything. The claim was just another of Calvin Mercer's lies, another way to control her, to force her back to a life she'd escaped at great cost. As the sound of pursuit grew closer, panic seized her. Felicity spotted a fallen tree with a hollow beneath it and threw herself into the cramped space, pulling dead branches to conceal her hiding place. She pressed a hand over her mouth to quiet her labored breathing, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. Minutes passed like hours. The forest grew quieter, though distant shouts still carried on the wind. The autumn chill seeped through her thin clothing, and Felicity shivered uncontrollably. Just as she considered moving to find better shelter, the sound of a single horse approaching made her freeze. The hoofbeats slowed to a stop. Felicity held her breath as boots thudded softly on the forest floor. They moved with purpose, stopping just outside her hiding place. A shadow fell across the opening of her refuge. A man knelt down, pushing aside the branches she'd arranged. Their eyes met hers wide with terror, his steady and assessing. He was a stranger, tall and broad-shouldered in a worn leather coat, with a tan Stetson pulled low over his forehead. A weathered face that had seen its share of hardship, but with kind eyes that belied his rugged appearance. "Madam," he said softly, his voice a deep rumble that somehow didn't frighten her, "those men are still searching. I can keep you safe if you'll let me." Felicity stared at him, calculating her odds. Trust a stranger or face the men hunting her. Neither option seemed good, but something in his honest gaze made her decision for her. "How do I know you're not one of them?" she whispered. "You don't," he answered simply. "But they're coming back this way, and they won't miss this hiding spot a second time." As if to emphasize his point, distant voices grew louder. Felicity swallowed hard and extended her trembling hand. The stranger's grip was warm and strong as he helped her from beneath the log. "Name's Yates Nolan," he said, leading her quickly to his horse. "Most folks just call me Yates." "Felicity Reed," she replied, her voice barely audible. Without further conversation, he helped her onto his horse and swung up behind her. With a gentle click of his tongue, they were moving through the forest, away from the sounds of pursuit. "I have a cabin," Yates explained, keeping his voice low. "It's well hidden. They won't find you there." Felicity nodded, not trusting her voice. She was putting her life in the hands of a stranger, but something told her this quiet cowboy might be her only chance at freedom if such a thing was possible anymore. They traveled in silence, Yates guiding the horse expertly through the dense forest. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the ground with golden patterns that shifted and changed as they passed. After what felt like hours, they approached a small clearing where a log cabin stood, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. "It's not much," Yates said as he helped her dismount, "but it's safe." The cabin was indeed modest but solidly built, nestled against the base of a small bluff with the forest providing natural cover. A small corral stood to one side where another horse nickered a greeting. Beyond that was a stream that bubbled cheerfully over smooth stones. "You live here alone?" Felicity asked, wrapping her arms around herself as she surveyed the peaceful homestead. Yates nodded as he led his horse to the corral. "Just me and the horses. My dog Rusty's around here somewhere, probably hunting. He's friendly, don't worry." Felicity followed him cautiously to the cabin door, still uncertain but with few options remaining. Inside, the cabin was tidy and warm, with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a small cooking area, and a bed in the corner with a colorful quilt. A curtain partitioned off another small section of the cabin. "You can rest behind that curtain," Yates said, gesturing to the partitioned area. "I'll sleep out here by the fire. Are you hungry?" As if on cue, her stomach growled loudly. She blushed, realizing she hadn't eaten since dawn. "Yes, thank you." While Yates busied himself with cooking, Felicity retreated behind the curtain to find a narrow cot with clean bedding. She sank onto it gratefully, her body suddenly aware of every bruise and scrape from her desperate flight. She examined her hands, scratched and dirty from crawling through undergrowth. What had her life become? "Miss Reed," Yates called after a while, "food's ready if you'd like to eat." She emerged to find a simple but hearty meal of beans, jerky, and biscuits waiting on the table. Yates had removed his hat, revealing dark hair with a slight wave to it, touched with silver at the temples. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his mid-30s, with lines around his eyes that suggested they smiled more often than they frowned. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Yates spoke. "I don't mean to pry, but those men seemed mighty determined. If I'm harboring you, I should know what I'm getting myself into." Felicity set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly gone. "They work for Calvin Mercer." Yates's expression darkened. "The businessman from Walla Walla, the one who owns half the town." "The very same," she confirmed. "I was employed in his household." "As what?" Yates asked. Felicity looked down at her plate. "I was hired as a tutor for his children, but Mr. Mercer. His intentions became clear shortly after I arrived." Yates's jaw tightened. "I understand." "No, you don't," she said quietly. "No one does. When I refused his advances, he claimed I stole jewelry from his wife. No one would believe my word over his. I fled when I heard he'd paid the sheriff to arrest me." "So you've been running ever since?" Felicity nodded. 3 days. I've been hiding in the woods, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and Walla Walla. I was heading toward the Idaho Territory. I thought if I could get far enough." Yates considered her story, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "You can stay here until we figure something out. Mercer's men rarely venture this deep into the forest." "Why are you helping me?" Felicity asked, unable to hide her suspicion. "You don't know me." Yates stood and collected their plates. "Let's just say I know what it's like to need a second chance." That night, Felicity lay on the narrow cot behind the curtain, listening to the occasional crackle of the fire and Yates's steady breathing from the main room. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. The events of the past days played through her mind on an endless loop. Mercer's unwanted advances, the false accusations, her desperate flight through the wilderness. She had come to Walla Walla with such hope after losing her parents to influenza. With her education, securing a position as a tutor had seemed like a blessing. How quickly that blessing had turned into a nightmare. As dawn broke, Felicity awoke from a fitful sleep to the smell of coffee. She hadn't realized she'd finally dozed off. She straightened her rumpled clothes as best she could before stepping out from behind the curtain. Yates stood by the stove, frying bacon in a cast iron pan. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's hot if you want some." "Thank you," she said, pouring herself a cup from the pot warming on the stove. The rich aroma was comforting, reminding her of mornings at home with her parents before illness had taken them. "I need to check my trap lines," Yates said as they ate breakfast. "Will you be all right here for a few hours?" Felicity nodded. "Yes, of course. There's a rifle above the door if you need it," he added, watching her carefully. "Do you know how to shoot?" "My father taught me," she replied, surprised at the offer, "though it's been some time." Yates seemed satisfied with her answer. "I'll be back before midday. Rusty will stay with you. He showed up late last night. He's outside now." After Yates left, Felicity ventured outside to meet the dog he'd mentioned. Rusty proved to be a friendly brown mutt with floppy ears who greeted her enthusiastically, as if they were old friends. The morning air was crisp and clear, the forest peaceful around the small cabin. For the first time in days, Felicity allowed herself to relax slightly, knowing she was temporarily safe. She spent the morning washing her clothes in the stream and hanging them to dry in the sunshine, borrowing one of Yates's shirts to wear in the meantime. It hung nearly to her knees, but it was clean. She explored the small homestead, noting the careful way Yates had arranged everything for efficiency: the woodpile stacked neatly against the cabin, the small garden plot with late-season vegetables, the smokehouse where meat was preserved for winter. Yates returned as promised before noon, carrying several rabbits from his traps. He paused when he saw Felicity wearing his shirt, but said nothing as he set about preparing the rabbits for cooking. "I can help with that," Felicity offered, watching him work. "I'm not useless in a kitchen." Yates glanced up, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I never thought you were, Miss Reed. Please call me Felicity," she said. "After all, you're saving my life." "Felicity, then," he agreed, handing her a knife. "Would you mind cutting these vegetables?" They worked side by side, preparing a rabbit stew that would simmer for hours. The domestic scene felt strangely comfortable, as if they'd done this many times before. Felicity found herself studying Yates when he wasn't looking: the careful way he moved, the strength in his hands, the occasional smile that transformed his serious face. "How long have you lived out here?" she asked as they worked. 5 years, he replied. "Before that, I drifted around taking work where I could find it, cowboying mostly, some mining when times were hard." "No family," a shadow crossed his face. "Not anymore." Felicity recognized the pain in his voice and didn't press further. They all had ghosts, it seemed. That evening, as they ate the stew by the fire, Yates broke their comfortable silence. "Those men who were chasing you, they'll be looking for a woman alone. They might come back through these parts, ask questions." Felicity's hand trembled slightly as she set down her spoon. "What are you suggesting? If anyone does come by, which is rare but does happen, it would be better if you were not hiding." "I don't understand." Yates looked uncomfortable for perhaps the first time since she'd met him. "If they saw a woman living here openly as my wife, they'd have no reason to suspect you're the one they are after." Felicity felt her cheeks warm at the suggestion. "You want me to pretend to be your wife, just if anyone comes around," he clarified quickly. "It would be safer for both of us." Mercer's men wouldn't look twice at a married couple living quietly in the woods. The logic was sound, even if the idea made her heart beat faster for reasons she couldn't quite explain. "All right," she agreed, "if it comes to that." The next few days fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Yates taught Felicity about life in the forest, how to identify edible plants, how to move silently through the trees, how to spot signs of animals and other humans. In return, she helped with chores around the cabin, mended his clothes, and in the evenings, read aloud from the few books he kept. One afternoon, as they worked together to prepare for the coming winter, Felicity finally asked the question that had been on her mind. Why did you really help me that day in the forest? Yates continued chopping wood for a moment before answering. I heard them talking while they searched. Heard what they planned to do when they found you. His knuckles whitened around the axe handle. No woman deserves that fate. But you put yourself at risk, she pressed. You still are. Yates set down the axe and turned to face her. 5 years ago, my wife and son were traveling to meet me in Montana. Their stagecoach was attacked. The driver fled, leaving the passengers to fend for themselves. His voice grew rough with emotion. Someone could have helped them, should have helped them. No one did. Felicity's heart ached for him. I'm so sorry, Yates, he nodded, picking up the axe again. After that, I couldn't stomach being around people much anymore, came out here to be alone. He swung the axe, splitting a log cleanly in two. But I made a promise to myself that I'd never turn away from someone who needed help. Not ever. That evening, as autumn rain pattered softly against the cabin roof, something shifted between them. The tragedy Yates had shared created a new understanding, a deeper trust. Felicity found herself watching him as he cleaned his rifle by the fire, his strong hands moving with practiced efficiency, his profile illuminated by the dancing flames. He looked up suddenly, catching her gaze. Instead of looking away embarrassed, Felicity held his eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Yates nodded, a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You're welcome, Felicity." Days turned into weeks as October gave way to November. The forest transformed around them, leaves turning brilliant shades of red and gold before falling to carpet the ground. The air grew colder, the nights longer. Yates ventured into a small trading post a day's ride away to sell furs and purchase supplies, returning with flour, coffee, sugar, and to Felicity's surprise fabric for a new dress and winter coat. "You didn't have to do that," she said, running her fingers over the deep blue wool. "Winter's coming," he replied simply. "You'll need something warmer than that torn dress." As Felicity worked on sewing her new clothes, she realized that the cabin had begun to feel like home. She'd arranged wildflowers in a jar on the table, organized Yates's books on a shelf, and added her touch to various corners of the small space. More surprising was how comfortable they'd become with each other working together during the day, talking by the fire in the evenings, sharing stories of their lives before. She learned that Yates had grown up on a ranch in Texas, that he'd fought briefly in the war before deserting, unable to stomach the killing, that he'd met his wife in a small town in Colorado while working cattle drives. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Missouri, her father's work as a schoolteacher, her mother's love of music, and her own dreams of someday opening a school. "You still could," Yates said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Open a school, I mean." Felicity shook her head. "Not with Mercer's accusations following me. No town would hire a woman suspected of theft. What if you went far enough away? Oregon, maybe, or California. Perhaps someday," she said, though they both knew the obstacles were significant for a woman alone. As November progressed, the first snow fell, blanketing the forest in white. The cabin became a warm haven against the growing cold. One morning, Yates returned from checking his traps with news that made Felicity's blood run cold. "I saw fresh tracks about 2 miles east," he said as he stamped snow from his boots. "4 men on horseback. They made camp not far from here." Felicity's hand flew to her throat. "You think it's Mercer's men?" "Can't be sure, but we should be careful," Yates replied, hanging his coat by the fire to dry. "Stay close to the cabin for now." That night, as the wind howled outside, bringing more snow, Felicity lay awake behind her curtain, listening for any sound that might indicate approaching danger. When she heard Yates moving restlessly by the fire, She knew he was awake too, standing guard while she slept. Unable to remain still, she rose and pushed aside the curtain. Yates sat in a chair by the fire, his rifle across his lap, his eyes alert despite the late hour. "You should sleep," he said when he saw her. "So should you," she countered, moving to sit in the chair opposite him. The fire cast a golden glow over the cabin, making shadows dance on the log walls. "We could take turns keeping watch." Yates shook his head. "I'm used to long nights." They sat in silence for a while, watching the flames. Felicity pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the cabin was far from cold. "What will happen when spring comes?" she asked finally, voicing the question that had been growing in her mind. Yates looked up, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "What do you want to happen?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't stay here forever living off your charity." "Is that what you think this is?" Yates asked, his voice low. "Charity?" Felicity looked at him, really looked at him, the man who had saved her, protected her, shared his home and his life with her these past weeks. "No," she said softly. "I don't think that's what this is at all." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken words. Then a sound outside, a branch snapping under weight, broke the spell. Yates was on his feet instantly, rifle raised, moving silently to the window. "Get behind the curtain," he whispered urgently. Felicity obeyed, her heart pounding. Through a small gap in the fabric, she watched as Yates positioned himself beside the door, every muscle tense. Minutes passed. Then came a sharp knock. "Nolan, you in there?" a gruff voice called. "We're looking for a woman, blonde, blue eyes, about 25. Seen anyone matching that description?" Yates glanced toward the curtain, meeting Felicity's frightened eyes for a moment before turning back to the door. He opened it just enough to reveal a sliver of his face. "What's all this about?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Sheriff's business," the man replied. "This woman's wanted for theft in Walla Walla, stole jewelry from Calvin Mercer's wife." "Haven't seen any woman," Yates said. "Been alone up here since summer." There was a pause. "Mind if we look around, just to be sure?" "It's the middle of the night in a snowstorm," Yates pointed out. "And I don't take kindly to strangers forcing their way into my home." The tension was palpable as Felicity held her breath. She knew Yates had his rifle just out of sight behind the door, if they insisted on entering. "We could come back in the morning," another voice suggested. "It's too damn cold to stand out here arguing." "Fine," the first man agreed reluctantly. "But we'll be back at first light, Nolan." "Suit yourselves," Yates replied calmly. "Your camp's east of here." "About 2 miles," the man confirmed. "How'd you know that?" "Saw your tracks this morning," Yates said. "Thought you might be trappers encroaching on my territory." The men seemed to accept this explanation. "We'll see you at dawn, then." Yates closed the door and waited until the sound of horses faded before turning to where Felicity stood, pale and trembling behind the curtain. "They'll be back," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed grimly, "but we won't be here." In a flurry of activity, they gathered essential supplies, food, blankets, ammunition, Felicity's newly finished winter coat. Yates packed everything onto the horses while Felicity erased all signs of her presence from the cabin. "Where will we go?" she asked as they prepared to leave, the cabin now appearing as if only one person lived there. "I have a friend," Yates said, helping her onto one of the horses. "An old trapper who lives deeper in the mountains. He'll hide us until we can figure out a more permanent solution." They set out into the snowy night, Rusty trotting alongside them. The forest was eerily beautiful in the moonlight, every branch outlined in white, their path obscured by the continuing snowfall. Yates led them along game trails and creek beds, places where their tracks would be hidden by morning. They rode in silence for hours, the cold seeping through even their warmest clothes. Felicity's fingers grew numb on the reins, her face stinging from the freezing air. Just when she thought she couldn't endure anymore, Yates pointed ahead to a plume of smoke rising from between the trees. "There," he said, "just a little farther." The trapper's cabin was even smaller than Yates's, but just as sturdy. Smoke curled from its chimney and light glowed from a single window. As they approached, the door opened, and an elderly man with a long white beard stepped out, a rifle in his hands. "Who goes there?" he called. "It's Yates Nolan," Yates answered, dismounting. "I need your help, Thomas." The old man lowered his rifle, squinting through the darkness. "Yates, what in tarnation are you doing out on a night like this?" His gaze shifted to Felicity. "And who's the lady?" "This is Felicity Reed," Yates said, helping her down from her horse. "We're in some trouble. Can we come in?" Thomas stepped aside, ushering them into the warmth of his cabin. "Any friend of Yates is welcome here," he said, nodding to Felicity. "Though I reckon there's more to this story than friendship." Once inside, with hot coffee warming their hands, Yates explained the situation. Thomas listened without interruption, his weathered face growing increasingly grave. "Mercer's a dangerous man to cross," he said when Yates finished. "His reach is long in these parts." "I know," Yates acknowledged, "but those men will be at my cabin by dawn. I couldn't let them find Felicity." Thomas studied them both over the rim of his coffee cup. "You can stay here as long as needed," he said finally. "I don't get many visitors this deep in the mountains, especially not in winter." "Thank you," Felicity said sincerely. "I don't know how we can repay your kindness." The old man waved away her thanks. "Any man who'd brave a night like this to protect a lady is either a fool or in love. Since I know Yates ain't no fool." He left the implication hanging in the air as he busied himself preparing a place for them to sleep. Felicity glanced at Yates, who was suddenly very interested in the contents of his coffee cup. A warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through her chest. They stayed with Thomas for 3 days, waiting for the immediate danger to pass. The old trapper proved to be a gracious host, sharing stories of his 50 years in the mountains that kept them entertained during the long winter evenings. He treated Felicity with a grandfatherly affection that touched her deeply. On the morning of the 4th day, Thomas returned from checking his traps with news. "Ran into a hunter I know," he reported. "Says those men have moved on, heading north toward the Canadian border. Word is they think the woman they are after fled that way." Relief flooded through Felicity. "So they're not looking for me here anymore. Seems that way," Thomas confirmed. "But that don't mean they won't come back. Mercer's not a man who gives up easily." Yates nodded thoughtfully. "We need a more permanent solution." That evening, as Thomas snored softly in his bed, Yates and Felicity sat by the fire, speaking in low voices. "We could go to Oregon," Yates suggested, "or California, somewhere Mercer has no influence." Felicity asked, her heart quickening at the implication. Yates met her gaze steadily. "I won't leave you to face this alone, Felicity. Not unless you want me to." The firelight danced across his features, illuminating the earnestness in his eyes. In that moment, Felicity knew with absolute certainty that her feelings for this quiet, honorable man had grown far beyond gratitude. "I don't want you to leave me," she admitted softly. "Ever." Yates reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "When I found you in those woods, I thought I was saving your life," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't realize you'd end up saving mine, too." Felicity's eyes filled with tears. "What do you mean?" "I've been alone for so long," he explained. "Living half a life, existing but not really living. Then you came, and suddenly my cabin wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a home again." His words echoed exactly what she had been feeling. Before she could respond, Yates continued, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "I know this isn't the right time or place," he said, "and I have nothing to offer you but a hard life in the wilderness, but I need you to know that I've come to care for you, Felicity, more than I thought possible." In answer, Felicity leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, tentative at first, then deepening as Yates pulled her closer. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. "I love you, Yates Nolan," Felicity whispered, "and I don't care if we live in a cabin or a cave or a palace. As long as we're together." The next morning, they told Thomas of their decision to travel west to Oregon Territory. The old trapper nodded approvingly. "Figured as much," he said with a knowing smile. "You two look at each other the way my Eliza and I used to." A shadow of old grief crossed his face before he brightened. "I'll pack you some provisions." As they prepared to leave, Thomas took Yates aside for a private word. Felicity busied herself with the horses, wondering what the two men were discussing so intently. When Yates returned to her side, his expression was thoughtful. "What was that about?" she asked. "Thomas had some advice," Yates replied, securing a pack to his saddle, "and a suggestion for our journey." Before Felicity could ask for details, Thomas emerged from his cabin carrying a small wooden box. "Almost forgot," he said, handing it to Yates. "Can't have a proper wedding without rings." Felicity's eyes widened as Thomas opened the box to reveal two simple gold bands. "These were mine and Eliza's," the old man explained. "Been keeping them all these years, though God knows why. Seems right they should be used again by folks who love each other." "Thomas, we couldn't possibly," Felicity began. "Hush now," Thomas interrupted gently. "Eliza would have wanted it this way. She was always a romantic soul." Tears pricked at Felicity's eyes as she embraced the old man. "Thank you," she whispered. "We'll treasure them always." As they rode away from Thomas's cabin, following game trails that would eventually lead them west, Felicity felt a lightness in her heart that had been absent for too long. The future was uncertain, the journey ahead fraught with dangers, but for the first time in months, she had hope. They traveled slowly through the mountain wilderness, taking care to avoid settlements where Mercer's influence might reach. At night, they made camp in sheltered spots, sleeping close together for warmth, their relationship deepening with each passing day. Yates taught Felicity more about surviving in the wilderness, how to track game, set traps, find water in unlikely places. She marveled at his knowledge and patience. One evening, as they sat beside their campfire in a small clearing, Yates took her hand. "Thomas suggested we stop at a place called Fort Klamath," he said. "There's a small settlement nearby. He says there's a preacher there who won't ask too many questions." Felicity's pulse quickened. "Are you asking me to marry you, Yates Nolan?" A rare, full smile transformed his face. "I reckon I am," Felicity Reed, "though I wish I could offer you more than a life on the run." "You're offering me everything I need," she replied, squeezing his hand. "Love, protection, a future. That's more than I dared hope for after I fled Mercer's house." Yates pulled her gently into his arms. "When we reach Oregon, we can start fresh. I have some savings, enough to buy land, build a proper home, and perhaps a small schoolhouse," Felicity suggested, looking up at him hopefully. "Anything you want," he promised, sealing the words with a kiss. Their journey continued through December, the winter landscape beautiful but treacherous. They crossed into Oregon Territory just before Christmas, grateful for the increasing distance between themselves and Mercer's influence. The land changed around them, the dense forests giving way to more open country as they traveled southwest toward Fort Klamath. They arrived at the fort in early January 1879, weary from travel but hopeful. The small military outpost, and the nearby settlement offered a welcome respite from their journey. As Thomas had promised, the local preacher asked few questions when Yates explained they wished to be married. "The Lord brings people together in mysterious ways," the elderly pastor said, smiling kindly at them. "Who am I to question his timing?" They were married the next day in the small wooden church, with only the preacher's wife and a few curious townsfolk as witnesses. Felicity wore her blue dress, freshly washed and mended, with wildflowers in her hair that Yates had somehow found despite the winter season. He stood tall and proud beside her, clean-shaven for the occasion, wearing the best clothes he owned. As they exchanged Thomas's gold rings and spoke their vows, Felicity felt tears of joy slipping down her cheeks. From that frightened woman hiding beneath a fallen log to this moment, it seemed impossible that only 3 months had passed. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Yates kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and devotion that left her breathless. The small congregation applauded, genuinely moved by the obvious love between the newly married couple. They stayed at Fort Klamath for 2 weeks, allowing themselves time to rest and plan their next move. Yates found work helping the local blacksmith, while Felicity assisted the preacher's wife with teaching the settlement's children. In the evenings, they returned to the small room they'd rented above the general store, learning the rhythms of married life with a joy that made even the simplest moments precious. During this time, Yates made inquiries about land for sale in the region. "There's a place about 30 miles west of here," he told Felicity one evening. "A small homestead where the owner died last year. His widow's looking to sell before she returns east." "Is it suitable?" Felicity asked, excitement building at the prospect of a permanent home. 20 acres, with a cabin that needs some work but is solid. Good water source, decent grazing land, some timber." Yates smiled at her enthusiasm. "And it's remote enough that we'd have privacy, but close enough to a small town that you could open a school someday." 2 days later, they rode out to see the property. The cabin was indeed in need of repair, but the setting was beautiful, a meadow surrounded by pine forests, with mountains visible in the distance. A stream ran along one edge of the property, clear and cold even in winter. "What do you think?" Yates asked, watching Felicity's face as she surveyed what could be their future home. In answer, she threw her arms around him. "It's perfect," she declared. "Absolutely perfect." They purchased the homestead the following day, using most of Yates's savings. As they signed the deed, Felicity felt a surge of emotion. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she had a real home again and a husband she loved with all her heart. Over the next few months, they worked tirelessly to make the cabin livable and prepare the land for spring planting. Yates repaired the roof and floors, built new furniture, and constructed a larger corral for their horses. Felicity planted a garden, made curtains from fabric purchased in town, and began collecting books for the school she hoped to open. As winter gave way to spring, their life settled into a pattern of hard work during the day and quiet evenings together. They rarely spoke of the danger that had brought them together, though both remained vigilant for any sign that Mercer's reach had extended to Oregon. In April, as the meadow bloomed with wildflowers, Felicity received news that filled her with both joy and trepidation. "Yates," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "I'm with child." Yates turned to her, his expression shifting from surprise to wonder to elation in the span of a heartbeat. "A baby," he whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make it untrue. Felicity nodded, tears of happiness shimmering in her eyes. "Due in November, I think." Yates gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass. "I love you," he murmured against her hair. "Both of you." The months that followed were filled with preparations. Yates built a cradle from pine, carving delicate patterns into the wood. Felicity sewed tiny garments, saving every scrap of soft fabric she could find. They discussed names, imagined what their child would look like, dreamed of the future they would provide. But beneath their happiness lurked a shadow. As Felicity's pregnancy progressed, Yates grew increasingly protective, sometimes waking in the night to check that the doors were securely locked, spending more time than necessary scanning the surrounding forest when he worked outside. "You think he's still looking for me?" Felicity asked one afternoon in late summer, catching Yates watching the road that led to their property with unusual intensity. Yates turned to her, his expression softening as he took in her rounded figure. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I won't take chances with your safety. Not now, not ever." In September, as the aspens began to turn gold, they received unexpected visitors. Yates was repairing a fence when he spotted two riders approaching. He hurried back to the cabin where Felicity was preparing dinner. "Stay inside," he instructed, reaching for his rifle. "There are riders coming." Felicity's hand flew to her stomach, her face paling. "Mercer's men?" "I don't think so, but be careful anyway," Yates replied, stepping onto the porch to meet the strangers. As the riders drew closer, Felicity peered through the window, her heart racing. They were an unlikely pair, an older man with a star pinned to his vest and a younger man in a suit that had seen better days. "Afternoon," the older man called as they reached the yard. "Looking for Yates Nolan." "You found him," Yates replied cautiously. "What's your business?" "Name's Marshal James Porter," the man said, dismounting. "This here's Mr. Edwin Walsh, a lawyer from Walla Walla." At the mention of Walla Walla, Yates's grip tightened on his rifle. "We've got no business with anyone from Walla Walla." The marshal raised his hands placatingly. "We're not here to cause trouble, Mr. Nolan. In fact, we bring good news for your wife." Before Yates could respond, Felicity stepped onto the porch, unable to contain her curiosity despite her fear. The lawyer's eyes widened at the sight of her advanced pregnancy. "Mrs. Nolan," he said, bowing slightly. "Or perhaps I should say Miss Reed, though I understand congratulations are in order on both your marriage and your impending arrival." "What news could possibly bring you all this way?" Felicity asked, moving to stand beside Yates. The lawyer opened his satchel and removed several documents. "Calvin Mercer is dead," he said without preamble. "Shot by a business rival 3 months ago." Felicity gasped, steadying herself against Yates's arm. "Dead?" "Yes, madam," the marshal confirmed. "And in the aftermath, certain irregularities in his business dealings came to light, including his treatment of several young women he employed." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Among his papers, we found evidence that the theft accusations against you were fabricated. The jewelry in question was found in his own safe, where he had hidden it himself." Felicity felt tears stinging her eyes. "So I'm cleared of all charges, completely," the lawyer affirmed. "In fact, Mrs. Mercer has instructed me to deliver this to you as compensation for the hardship you endured." He extended an envelope. "It contains a bank draft for $500 and a formal letter of apology." Yates and Felicity exchanged shocked glances. $500 was a small fortune, enough to complete all the improvements they'd planned for their homestead and still have money left over. "How did you find us?" Yates asked, still suspicious despite the good news. The marshal smiled. "An old trapper named Thomas came through Walla Walla last month. When he heard about Mercer's death and the cleared charges, he mentioned he knew where you folks had settled. Said you deserved to know you were free." That evening, after their unexpected visitors had departed with promises that all legal documents would be sent to the nearest town for their records. Yates and Felicity sat on their porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "I can hardly believe it," Felicity said, her head resting on Yates's shoulder, "to be free of that fear after so long." "You deserve it," Yates said, his arm tight around her, "after everything you've been through." Felicity placed her hand over his. "We deserve it," she corrected gently. "You've carried this burden with me from the moment you found me hiding in those woods." Yates kissed her temple. "And I'd do it again in a heartbeat." As autumn painted the landscape in brilliant hues of red and gold, Felicity and Yates used the unexpected windfall to complete work on their home and purchase additional livestock. They hired a carpenter from town to help. Yates built a small schoolhouse at the edge of their property, fulfilling Felicity's dream. In late November, as the first snowflakes began to fall, Felicity gave birth to a son they named Thomas James Nolan, in honor of the old trapper who had helped them and the marshal who had brought them news of their freedom. The baby had Yates's dark hair and Felicity's blue eyes, a perfect blend of both parents. As Felicity nursed their son before the fire on a cold December evening, Yates sat beside them, his face filled with a contentment that still sometimes surprised him. "I never thought I'd have this again," he confessed quietly. "A family, a purpose." Felicity reached for his hand. "When you found me that day, you said you'd keep me safe. You've done that and so much more, Yates." "We've kept each other safe," he corrected, gently touching their son's downy head. "And now we have even more to protect." The winter passed peacefully, their small family cocooned in warmth and love despite the snow that sometimes piled high around their cabin. By spring, Felicity was ready to open her school, having sent word to nearby homesteads that she would teach any children who could attend. The response was enthusiastic, with 6 children from neighboring farms enrolling immediately. As the years passed, their homestead flourished. They added to their livestock, expanded their crops, and built additional rooms onto the cabin as their family grew. Thomas was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, 2 years later, and another brother, William, 2 years after that. Felicity's school gained a reputation for excellence, eventually attracting students from as far as the nearby town. Yates managed their growing farm with skill, also serving as a guide for occasional hunting parties, his knowledge of the wilderness highly valued. They never forgot how they had found each other, a desperate woman fleeing through the woods, a lonely cowboy offering protection. Each year on the anniversary of their meeting, they would walk together in the forest near their home, remembering the fear and danger that had ultimately led to their happiness. On one such anniversary, as they stood in a clearing watching their 3 children play among the wildflowers, Felicity turned to Yates with tears in her eyes. "10 years ago today, you found me hiding beneath that fallen log," she said, squeezing his hand. "I was so frightened, so certain my life was over." Yates pulled her close, his arms as strong and sure as they had been that first day. And now, Felicity looked at their children, at the home they had built together, at the man who had kept his promise to keep her safe. "Now I know it was just beginning." As the sun set over their homestead, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Yates and Felicity walked hand in hand back toward their cabin, their children running ahead, their future stretching before them as wide and promising as the Oregon sky. In the distance, a lone wolf howled, a sound that had once filled Felicity with dread, but now reminded her of the wilderness that had brought her to Yates. The journey from that desperate flight through the Washington woods to this peaceful life in Oregon had been long and sometimes difficult, but she wouldn't change a moment of it. That night, as their children slept and the house grew quiet, Yates and Felicity stood on their porch, looking up at the stars that had guided them on their journey west. The same stars that had witnessed their first meeting, their escape, their wedding, the birth of their children, all the moments, large and small, that had woven together to create the tapestry of their shared life. "I love you, Felicity Nolan," Yates whispered, his arms around her waist. "And I love you, Yates Nolan," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows." In the silence that followed, broken only by the distant hooting of an owl and the gentle rustling of pine needles in the night breeze, they stood together, no longer a woman fleeing danger and a cowboy offering sanctuary, but partners in all things. Their love as enduring as the mountains that surrounded their home. The story that had begun with fear and desperation had transformed into one of courage, devotion, an abiding love, proof that even in the wildest, most dangerous places, hearts can find their way home.